Okay, in this tutorial we're going to talk about some of what it takes now that we've introduced cultural threads and the idea of beginning to evaluate a cultural setting, what it really takes, what's required for us to adjust to a new cultural setting. And there are lots of challenges for us in that our relocating into any new cultural situation is really a massive step for most of us. The changes and the contrasts in simple things such as language, food, television, weather, shopping, the way we shop, the way we socialize with others, as we've seen in our 4 examples, they're just really a small part, but a sizable challenge in how we relocate into a different setting. Often, the deeper differences that are represented by those, what would see as surface level issues in customs and ways that people think, and ultimately in worldview, how people interact interpersonally. They have a profound effect and do indeed take a toll on us as we interact with another cultural context in the early days. There are many different reactions and feelings that people have as they are faced with that challenge of moving and living long-term in what is initially a very unfamiliar cultural context for them. It seems exciting at first, usually for most. Daunting, but exciting. It may be interesting, positive even, in the time of learning, yet there will be certainly days to come when we're overwhelmed and feel that we want to just get back to our own culture where the tension can be resolved, we can be comfortable and we can relax. And so no matter what kind of a person we are, what kind of even preparation we've previously had, one of the major factors in our ability to survive and be successful is the willingness that we have to make the adjustments. And then in keeping with our willingness to make adjustments, a regular motivation to keep walking, keep pressing through the times of challenge that will inevitably come for us in cross-cultural situations. Our motivation, of course, as we think of willingness and motivation, our motivation is definitely based on our purpose for being there. That purpose sustains us in that new culture and puts us in that place of wanting to be involved there in the first place. If we really can see the deep and satisfying answer to our core question, which is, what am I doing here? Why am I here? Why am I and my family even here? If we have a good answer to that question, then as we go through the initial stages of adjusting, that will help us as much as anything else. If we can be really convinced that God is the one who's guided us to a setting, and we're there to fulfill the purposes that He has, that we can trust Him with all the details then of our living situation, new foods, new neighbors, new social relationships, all of the multitude of daily adjustments that we're going to have to make. That knowledge of our purpose in God's goodness will help us to have patience as we think through the challenges of the process. And it's easier said than done, but really acknowledging God having us in a place can allow us to relax internally, because we know that He is in control and He can actually help us to see the enjoyable side of cultural adjustment, the fun of it. See it as something that's positive and a productive challenge for us. And that, seeing life that way, seeing the adjustment that way, can be a very significant part of how God works in us to make us more like Lord Jesus Christ, as we think of Christ and His example for us in some of those very areas. Now, there are several distinct stages that cross-cultural workers have pointed out and we recognize in relationship to cultural adjustment. As we adjust to a new culture, new activities, and a host culture, or what we would describe as a host culture, I think it's helpful for us, each one of us, to look at those stages because we can recognize in ourselves that we're going through some very similar feelings and attitudes as what's represented in these stages. And then that helps us to be more prepared and even more objective about the time of passing through those stages. Now, we couldn't say that every person's experience is exactly the same as another's, but by and large, there are some tendencies, there are some thoughts and feelings that you and or your family will probably or may well experience during your initial adjustment to a new cultural and living situation. These come into the category of what we would describe as cultural shock or culture shock. That's a term that any of us who've dealt with the second culture have probably heard, and you may have a vague or even a fairly established idea of what that is. But when people use it in reference to expatriates relocating into a host culture, it refers to that process of coming to understand and to eventually accept, I trust in a healthy way, the differences culturally as we daily interact with different people, another group of people in a different set of situations. And so cultural shock really is just one perspective of that whole issue of cultural adjustment, really. And so the idea of cultural adjustment would better cover the whole spectrum of what we're engaged with as we work into a new cultural situation. Many people planning to make a move to a new culture have actually hopefully had time to think about the move and to prepare for it in some ways. And so the shock of a cross-cultural situation won't be so extreme because it won't hit them in an unexpected, out of the blue way that they have no control over. For most people, adjusting to a second culture is actually a gradual process, and it has a mix of both positive and negative experiences. And so we're gradually adjusting to a new set of rules for living and relating and communicating and just about everything else in those areas of cultural threads that we've talked about. As we in effect, and this is a great challenge to us, but as we are becoming different people through those new life experiences in the process of making the cultural adjustment. Now, there are some factors, of course, that make cultural adjustment more difficult for some people than others, having to do with the level of preparation they've had for another culture. If they haven't thought much about the reality of change before they left, they'll probably struggle to really believe that cultural differences are extreme as they are, and then when they encounter them, they'll be really challenged by the reality of that. People who haven't had adequate preparation will tend to impose their own cultural value system on the people around them, and that leave them to think that those people who are behaving differently in a second cultural situation are behaving, in fact, wrongly. That they may come to the wrong conclusions about why and what people are doing. They'll tend to think that the way that they themselves behave is natural and normal. By instinct, we as human beings in societies do that. And that the way other people behave is at the least misguided. And so generally people who think like this have had limited contact with people who are different from themselves, and so their experience hasn't given them a basis for believing in and understanding the real breadth and scope of the difference that exists, and an acceptable difference that exists across cultural boundaries like this. Cultural adjustment also is a process that doesn't just affect people in a certain age bracket or niche, but all people of all different walks of life and ages. So even different kinds of businesses, whether you're a teacher or a manager or someone in sports or just some other type of business person, an aid worker, medical, whatever kinds of categories of business relationship or work that you do, or if you're a child, a teenager, an adult, everyone to a different, and to some degree for sure, deals with an adjustment as a part of relocating to another cultural setting. And so as we've said, just with that in mind, that we want to recognize these stages of what we're redefining in a sense as cultural adjustment. Remembering that these are processes that are common for all of us, and that these stages can be worked through, that there's a process to be worked through, and that we can indeed gradually become familiar and comfortable in a new situation. So let's give 4 of the common ways that we could describe the stages of the cultural adjustment that we're talking about. Now, the first of those is the honeymoon stage, and you see, in fact, all 4 of them listed here, but the first of which is the honeymoon stage. That initial enthusiasm that covers really a short period of time in a new country, that excitement, the hope, the difference, and the exotic nature of life there, the quaintness of life there, the tendency to have a generally positive attitude because of that change and enthusiasm for the most part in the early days. The new things that are experienced are viewed as interesting. And then little really is expected of you because you're seen as someone who's new. And so you're primarily passively engaging or interacting with the host culture. Now, in the honeymoon stage, most of us would be very unaware of the cultural differences that are taking place there, that we may not even notice. You may not notice that you're making cultural mistakes, and that you may be jumping to conclusions or drawing conclusions, misinterpreting the behavior going on around you without an awareness of that you don't have reason at that point to trust your instincts. Your instincts are still guiding you in your interpretive decisions in that situation in the honeymoon stage. And so kind of a naive bliss, if you will, in interacting with a culture for the first time. But it doesn't take very long, usually, for most of us to feel that second stage, the cultural fatigue. That early realization that there will be significant challenge to adjusting. So those first few weeks go by, and we're more widely exposed to the country and the culture, and our mindset, our view of the situation becomes more realistic. And our reactions to different events become more mixed. As we're trying to reestablish a routine of life for ourselves in that setting, that even that very act, because there are so many differences that can be difficult to accomplish. And so the previous naive enthusiasm now is mixed with frustration often. And we start to feel vulnerable and out of our element. We start to feel a sense of dependence on what we would have been comfortable with. And people experience homesickness. That's not unusual. That life, what should be easy and routine, is not easy, and it's no longer very fun. And one of the real contributing, complicating factors to that is that the language ability is limited. And so that undermines our confidence because we don't feel like we can communicate well with people. And lots of times the communities of expats begin to draw together in those situations. And bonds are formed between expats who can identify themselves together in a sense as people who are different from the locals. But that difference in behavior that they experience together, combined with the stress of adapting to new daily routines, can become very quickly a critical spirit and a critical attitude of the host culture. And then the symptoms of that cultural fatigue, the second stage of cultural adjustment, start to appear many times. Boredom, lethargy, looking for distractions, irritability, critique and criticism, hostility even at times towards the host culture, and lack of understanding expressed. Now, when you reach this second stage and you're experiencing that cultural fatigue, you're realizing fairly clearly that there are differences, I trust, between the way that you would typically interact and the way that people locally behave. But the problem is, one of the problems is that you don't understand very well what the differences are, how many there are, how deep they are. And so you know there's a problem. You're at least sensing that something's not right. My life is not comfortable here. But you're not sure, probably to your benefit at that point, about the size of the problem. And you begin to doubt, in a way, your own instincts to evaluate because the reference points are so different. There's so much that you don't understand. You start to worry even and feel discouraged maybe even or despondent about how hard it's going to be to figure this thing out. And it's a tough place to be in that second stage. But by God's grace, we begin to adjust. As we persist in those situations, we begin an initial adjustment. After those first 6 months, let's say, or so, that we begin to feel our way into what it means to reestablish an acceptable life routine. We begin to understand, even in language terms, what it means to begin to get by, how we do what we are able to do, how we communicate even in that limited way with people, regular daily activities. And now we begin to actually see, because we've experienced the routine of life over a course of months, now we see some of the ways that people do things culturally as fairly normal. And we're adjusting also to the physical aspects of the host environment. The heat or the cold or whatever the case may be that we're not familiar with initially may become more normal to us. And we become more self-reliant, I trust, that we're growing to be more positive about, hey, I may be able to actually function in this setting, that there may be a possibility to accomplish this. And getting to the place in initial adjustment where we're beginning to understand and empathize even with the host culture, that we start to develop that ability. And we're developing, at least in our immediate environment, a sense of comfort with the routine and the surroundings. Now, one of the challenges before us still as we adjust initially and become more comfortable is that we know the cultural differences exist, and we know what some of them are, and we try to adjust accordingly, and yet it's not natural for us. We still are making an initial adjustment a conscious effort to be appropriate in the ways that we behave culturally. But we're very aware, or we're becoming increasingly aware at least, that some of our behavior is, at least we're able to process how it's coming across to the local people. And so even subconsciously, but sometimes very overtly, we're understanding what it means to replace our old instinctive reactions with the new ones that are representative more of appropriate behavior in that cultural setting. And we now begin to understand in this period of initial adjustment that there is light at the end of the tunnel, in that sense, that there's a way to figure out how to live life in an adequate sense there, that there's adjustment that can be made. And then a fourth stage in cultural adjustment is just simply described as further adjustment. The rebuilding of a sense of enthusiasm in having relocated to the country maybe even a year or more prior, and that relocation and the pain of the honeymoon and the cultural fatigue and the initial adjustment is becoming a more distant memory to us as the host country now is feeling much like home, that the effects of the adjustment are lessening, and that we're able to genuinely enjoy that new location, that we're developing a real enjoyment of that. And that we're actually, in many cases, beginning to adopt elements of the host culture's behavior and values. That we find ourselves criticizing a lot less and seeing the differences and accepting them. And certain areas, even in fact, I think of situations where certain areas of the host culture we prefer them to the way that we would have done things before. And that as our language ability develops, that we can communicate fairly well, and relationships that are meaningful to us begin to develop, and they become closer, and that helps to provide a sense of relaxing for us, that we can socialize with local people and have deeper conversations with them that provide for a shared value and meaning between us. And so in that further adjustment phase, not having to constantly think overtly about whether we're doing the right thing in order and sequence in social settings, that we're able to start to behave in culturally appropriate ways, and that in fact can become more like second nature to us. That we can trust the newly developed instincts because they've been reconditioned by that cultural setting. And then at that point, taking a lot less effort to be culturally sensitive in that setting. And boy, that sounds easy to describe in short order, but it's a long and challenging process for us. But by God's providence, we can get to that point. We can get to the place where we're really adjusting well, and we're able to be effective, socialized, and communicators in a context. Here's a diagram that shows those 4 stages of adjustment. And you see the dip in the middle that indicates that fatigue, but then the progression upward towards a more positive comfort level as we spend time in a new country. And so seeing that purpose that God has for us, seeing the ways that He sustains us as we work our way through the cultural adjustments that need to be made in order to become effective in a new context.